Welcome to the Big Ten. Mark Rogers TV continuing our series looking at every Power 5 conference schedule in the nation in 2014. We are done with the SEC. We've completed 14 teams in the SEC. Please check out those video posts. We're pretty harsh on a few teams in the SEC and credit some others. I'm sure the same thing will happen in the Big Ten. And we welcome in the newcomers first. So we start with the newbies, and we go with the Maryland Terps. And the first thing I notice here is this is an old-fashioned Big Ten schedule, in that Maryland is playing all its four non-conference opponents first. All the non-conference slate out of the way the first 4 weeks, then they dive into Big Ten play. So Maryland's non-conference slate looks like this. Opening week, James Madison. Typical softy. Got no issue with that as long as it toughens up from there. All right, South Florida. Big difference there. South Florida has been difficult in years gone by, but the program on some tough sledding in recent years, South Florida should be a significant underdog, even at home in Tampa, Florida against Maryland. So the Terps then, go to two decent games here. I like these not just from the standpoint of the level of difficulty, but also these are type games that Maryland should play in going head-to-head with some recruiting wars in their own backyard. So on September 13th, they stay home in College Park and they take on old rival West Virginia. If you go back to the 80s and maybe even before that, you remember when Maryland and West Virginia played all the time, and they played as Eastern powers along with Syracuse and Penn State, and none of those teams belonged to a conference at that point. West Virginia, Maryland, that's a nice little matchup. Of course, West Virginia now in the Big 12 conference, Maryland joining the Big 10. So you get a Big 12, Big 10 matchup that doesn't look like one. Maryland hosting West Virginia. Then the next week, almost the same thing. Another old foe in Syracuse and Maryland, with Syracuse moving to the ACC, Maryland leaving the ACC. Syracuse at home in this one. That is non-conference foe number 4. So though Maryland doesn't play anybody extremely tough, there's no USC or Texas on the schedule, I like the games against West Virginia and Syracuse. They do play two quality opponents. South Florida's on the fringe of that. Don't know when that game was scheduled, but Maryland could have been thinking that it was scheduling a very difficult game in South Florida at the time. So again, it's James Madison at home. They go to Tampa to take on South Florida. Then they stay home for West Virginia, then go to the Dome to take on Syracuse near the end of September. All right, then we get to see Maryland as a Big Ten team. And looking at this slate, Big Ten administrators did the same thing basically to Nebraska a couple years ago, not giving the Huskers any favors their first year or two in the league. They treat Maryland much the same. So the Big Ten got rid of that ridiculous legends and leaders concept, and they're going east and west, and it makes sense geographically. It makes total sense. In terms of the balance of power, most people would think the East is dominant with Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, and Penn State added to Indiana, Maryland, and Rutgers. The power in the West is with basically Wisconsin, Nebraska, and to a certain extent Iowa, bouncing back last season to go 8-5. So for Maryland, of course, they play the Eastern Division foes. Then in the West, they play two games. And my criticism of the SEC is the same criticism of the Big Ten. You've got 14 teams, you're playing 8 games. Therefore, you're missing 5 opponents. So the difference in schedule, we will point out. For Maryland, they're playing possibly the two best teams in the West, Wisconsin and Iowa. So again, the Big Ten doing no favors to its latest member here, Maryland. So the schedule looks like this. They go to Indiana to open up their Big Ten ledger in the history of Maryland football. Then they stay home for Ohio State and Iowa. This is a difficult, didn't see this, 6-game stretch. Listen to this one. For the Terps, they've got Ohio State, Iowa, Wisconsin, Penn State, Michigan. Okay. In those 6 games, if they come out 2-4, they're doing some work. I think 2-4 would be a good goal for the Terps to go 2-4, and then they could possibly beat Indiana and Rutgers as the finale. Rutgers at home, so they could go 4-4 in the Big Ten. I'm looking more likely at 3-5 for Maryland, with a possibility at 4-4 in the Big Ten. Again, it's the Buckeyes and the Hawkeyes at home. Then they've got to travel to Wisconsin and Penn State. They've got Michigan State at home. Then they go to Ann Arbor to take on the Wolverines before they close out in what could be a Big Ten finale. And in trying to build some tradition with Maryland and Rutgers, the Terps and the Scarlet Knights finish off at College Park, Maryland. So not going to predict a record here, but I would think Maryland goes 3-5 in the Big Ten. They win 3 of 4 out of conference, and that gives them a 6-6 record, and they go bowling their first year in the Big Ten. That should be a pretty realistic goal for Maryland. They could do better. They could go 4-4 Big Ten and then sweep those non-conference games. It's possible with the Terps this season. All right, Maryland fans, first year in the Big Ten. What do you think of that slate? You got the two toughies in the West, Wisconsin and Iowa. Would love to hear from you now on Mark Rogers TV.